You didn't notice it at first. There was no fight, no confrontation, just a feeling, quiet and creeping, that something around you had changed. The people who once filled the space around you began to disappear, not all at once, one by one, like lights going out in a building you still lived in. You walked into rooms and conversations stopped. Groups pulled tighter together, and somehow, without a single word directed at you, you understood you were no longer included. Then came the moment you heard something, a version of yourself you didn't recognize, spoken in someone else's voice, and it stopped you completely. You reached out, you waited, but the silence that came back was louder than any answer could have been. Someone had written a story about you, and they had pinned it where everyone could see it, everywhere except in front of you. What you didn't know yet was that someone was pulling the strings, quietly, carefully, moving people like pieces on a board, pointing them away from you. They didn't show people who you really were. They showed them a shadow, exaggerated, distorted, built from scribbled half-truths, and the shadow was easier to believe than the light. The truth felt small and weightless against the mountain of feeling they had stacked against you. And that was the cruelest part, not the lies, but how little truth seemed to matter. You tried to gather it all, to understand, to trace it back to its beginning. You carried their words even when those words were never meant to be yours. They had already spoken. The crowd had already leaned in, already absorbed the version of you that someone else had constructed. You were defined before you could speak. You pressed your hands against the glass of your own life and watched everyone on the other side, connected, laughing, together, while you stood in the cold and quiet of being left out. This isolation was not accidental, it was designed. Someone understood that alone you would be easier to define, easier to dismiss, easier to control from a distance. And so you sat with it, the silence, the aloneness, the terrible stillness of a life that had suddenly gone very, very quiet around you. You remembered what it felt like before. You could still see it clearly, who you were when you were surrounded, when you were included, when none of this had happened yet. And the distance between that and now felt unbearable. You tried to speak. You opened your mouth, reached for the words, tried to explain, but the explanation dissolved before it could reach anyone. No one was positioned to receive it. You held your hands open, you showed your palms, you offered every honest word you had, and still the backs remained turned. Still, no one looked. You chased the thread of it, trying to find where the truth had been separated from the lie. But the tangle was enormous, and the deeper you went, the more exhausted you became. And then, quietly, something shifted, not outside of you, inside. You simply stopped, not in defeat, in something that felt, strangely, like the first breath of clarity. You closed your eyes, you let the noise continue around you, and for the first time, you chose not to move against it. The stillness you found in that moment was unlike anything the chaos outside could touch. You began to understand that time was not your enemy, that every false thing carries within it the seed of its own collapse. You didn't need to rush the unraveling, you just needed to let the sand fall. The path ahead was dark, and the light you carried was small. But you took the next step anyway, and then the one after that, not because you could see clearly, but because you had decided to keep going. You stopped looking outward for the thing that would make you feel stable, and when you turned inward, you found something you had forgotten was there. Something rooted, something real, something that had been yours all along. The version of you that needed constant approval began to fade, not painfully, like a coat too heavy for the season, finally laid down, and what remained underneath was lighter and truer than anything you had worn before. You looked at yourself, really looked, and for the first time in a long time, the person looking back didn't seem like a stranger. You were beginning to come home to yourself. Outside, the storm still raged, words still flew, stories still circulated, but inside where you stood, something had gone deeply, permanently still. You were no longer at the mercy of what was happening out there. Without your reactions to feed it, the other person's confidence began to hollow out. They pushed, nothing came back. They provoked, silence answered. And in that silence, their certainty began to crack. You had simply stopped playing. No announcement, no dramatic exit. You just quietly refused to move your pieces anymore. And the game, without your participation, had nowhere left to go. The mask they had worn, the performance of certainty, of righteousness, of victimhood, could not hold its shape forever. Beneath it, something far more fragile had always been hiding. The whispers still came, but they no longer landed. They dissolved before they could reach you, like rain that evaporates before it touches the ground. You had become someone the words could not find. You looked back along the road you had walked, and for the first time you could see it all clearly. Every hard passage, every moment of doubt, every night you almost didn't make it through, and you were still standing. Something had taken root in you through all of this, something that could not be argued away or socially engineered out of existence. You were grounded now in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of you. They watched you from a distance now, and what they saw was not what they had planned for. They had expected collapse. Instead, they witnessed the quiet, undeniable emergence of someone they could no longer reach. The people who truly belonged in your life began to find their way to you. Not a crowd, just a few. The ones who never needed a perfect version of you, only the real one. You stood before the blank space of what comes next, and you were not afraid. Behind you, everything you had survived. Ahead, everything you had not yet built. And in your hand, the only tool that ever mattered, yourself. You looked out at all that open space, and for the first time, it did not feel like emptiness. It felt like room. Room to grow, to choose, to become, without anyone else's story written over yours. Everything that tried to break you is behind you now, growing smaller with every step forward you take. And you are still here, still whole, still walking, and that alone says everything.